Hello, I'm Chris Wilson, Director of Experience Design at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. And I'd like to welcome you to this History Film Forum discussion of the 2021 film LFG on the United States women's national soccer team's battle for equal pay. We began History Film Forum with the understanding that while millions of people visit the Smithsonian and other museums every year, many more people learn history on the screen. So we felt it important to look at film as public history, film as a vehicle for interpreting and presenting history that reaches so many people. This film by Andrea Nix Fine and Sean Fine and produced by Abby Greensfelder is an example of film presenting a contemporary story, really of history in the making, where history offers an important backdrop to fully understand it. I want to thank HBO and CNN for their cooperation on this program, our partners at Smithsonian Associates, and Dan Manat and Democracy Films for the generous support that makes these programs happen. Our guests for this discussion include Andrea Nix Fine and Sean Fine, who are award-winning filmmakers and producers whose raw, intimate storytelling style has been hailed by critics as visually ravishing and enormously spirit-raising. Their documentary short, Inocente, a coming-of-age story centering on a 15-year-old homeless, undocumented female immigrant in California, won an Oscar in 2013 and was the first crowd-funded film to earn such a distinction. Previously, the Fines' first feature-length documentary, War Dance, about child soldiers in Uganda, was nominated for an Academy Award in 2007. And their 2013 HBO film, Life According to Sam, won both a Peabody and Emmy for exceptional merit in documentary filmmaking. In 2021, the Fines launched their Impact Studio Change Content with an edict to develop true stories into unforgettable narratives and docs that upend the way viewers think and feel about critical issues. They are proud to premiere LFG as the first of many products that align with Change Content's mission, True Stories, True Impact. Abby Greensfelder is founder and CEO of Every Woman Studios, a full-service media company with a mission to tell female-focused, female-driven stories, creating positive cultural impact. A former network executive and production company head, Greensfelder launched Every Woman after seeing the massive gender gap in the entertainment ecosystem. She founded Every Woman Studios to address this gap via high quality and commercial content, while also partnering with premium brands and spearheading comprehensive impact campaigns around important issues. And we're also thrilled to welcome Becky Sauerbrunn, defender and captain of the United States women's national soccer team. And as she's described in the film, a person who's considered the conscience of the team and a leader and inspiration for women's soccer and women and girls in all sports. And now I'd like to welcome my colleague, Ken Cohen, curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History.
Thanks, Chris. And thanks so much to all of our guests here for this conversation about a very important film and a very important case that's ongoing. And so I'd like to start actually, because not all of our viewers may have seen the film yet. I think it's important for them to know a little bit about the documentary to begin with. So if I can ask Andrea and Sean, can you tell us a little bit about the storyline from your perspective? What's the narrative here? What's the storyline and the trajectory?
Well, I think in some ways it's kind of interesting to have it start with the lawsuit itself, because on March 8th, International Women's Day, 2019, the U.S. women's soccer team drops this lawsuit against its employer, the U.S. Soccer Federation, for gender discrimination. And this team is beloved globally. They're the best in the world at what they do. They're icons of the sport and really well-known in popular culture. So it scratches at this big question, like what basis and why would these women of all women feel like they're undervalued? And so what this film sets out to do is tell the story from their perspective of what it feels like to go through this lawsuit, understand who they are, how it speaks to a larger picture of where women are valued in sport and in the workplace in general. But it's a very personal take on what it is like. So it's basically inside the team as they go through, along with their village of the lawsuit and their PR department, as it follows through the lawsuit, as it unfolds, of how they go about trying to get equally valued from the U.S. Soccer Federation. So that's really what we did with is there anything else?
No, I mean, I think it's also remarkably, it's kind of a David and Goliath story. I think it's a story of somebody trying to, be heard by, Goliath that's not listening and that's not open to listening to what this team wants and what they deserve. And so I think the film, like Andrea said, tells it from their perspective, from their side as they go through this process and what that entails, what that fight is like, and from the inside, how difficult it is.
And Becky, from your perspective as somebody, of course, obviously, who is playing games and having a career in the sport, B, participating in the lawsuit, and then C, having this additional element sort of follow you through both of these things. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like?
Yeah, I would definitely say that you feel vulnerable. I mean, it's a fight that we wanted to make public, but then when you add the layer of having a team follow you with a camera, and see some of the hardest moments of the fight. And if you get a chance to see the film, I think you see some of those moments where we hit really tough obstacles, we have really rough days, but then there are a lot of triumphs as well. And so it was very different and something that I've never done before, obviously, a new experience, but I'm so glad that we had Andrea and Sean be able to show our story and have it so perfectly encapsulated and have our personalities and all those things really show through. And I feel like it's a really true portrayal of what we continue to fight for and what we're going through.
That's a really great segue to a question that I had wanted to ask also, which is about sort of the narrative structure of the film, the way the sort of storyline unfolds, because you have these individuals and you really see how their character on the field translates in some, I think, unexpectedly literal ways to dynamics off the field in general, but specifically in the case. And so I wanted to ask Andrea and Sean, is that obviously an intentional element to sort of show this trajectory of what's going on with the case on the one hand, and on the other hand, the sort of season and continuing match schedule of the players. So you have these sort of two trajectories going on at the same time, and the players who have these very important stories to tell sort of going back and forth or doing both at the same time in many cases. There's images of players on cell phones making calls about the case during water breaks at practice, right?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it was really to show, I think there's a misconception that when people file a lawsuit, they hire, or when the US, women's national team filed this lawsuit, that they just hired some lawyers and the lawyers do their thing and they give testimony and that's it. But that's not the case. I mean, this is a very complex lawsuit. I also don't think after following the women and following their lawsuit, I don't think they would ever do that. They're not those kinds of people. This is their lawsuit. They're going to make sure it's done right, just like they make sure they win every game the right way. And there's a chemistry within this team. There's like an unbelievable chemistry, but at the same time, something we tried to capture is there's an individuality. This team is made up of so many different types of people, and yet they come together to accomplish one thing. And I think, especially in this time that we're in, I think we also learned a lot from that. I mean, this is a time where we're so divided as a country and all these people, but I think watching this group of people come together on something and say, and that was remarkable, just to say, every decision they make is the team's decision. And that was a remarkable thing to be able to watch and witness as well as they go through this.
And I think it's interesting in that the way in which we usually tell our films is the favorite way is, at the end of the day, to capture someone's attention, it's like, make me care, right? How do I care? Well, I want to relate to the person I'm watching. So you may not watch soccer, you may not know anything about the law, but people are moved by the human experience and what they're doing. So we set out to observe who are the players that start to pop, like who are the players who are taking leadership positions in this lawsuit and on the field. And it sort of naturally intersects that way, it seems like, anyway, on the team. So, and then you start to understand that the people that are taking those leadership positions are also part of a group of 7 that sort of appointed themselves to work with on this law case. So Becky's one of them, Kelly O'Hara, Megan Rapinoe, like those folks are the more seasoned, experienced players, and they were kind of at the forefront. But yet they also want to make sure they're passing a baton to younger players to take up the fight. And then you also want to have a player come on who's a little bit sort of very new to the process, and Jessica McDonald, that she just made this team. She's a very seasoned soccer player, but she just made this national team. So she's kind of, it's always wonderful in a storytelling device to have a person who's kind of understanding it in some ways where the audience is understanding them, that they're trying to make sense of it as they're moving through it. And it helps you as a storytelling, way into someone's journey of someone who's like, what is going on? Which is what she says so amazingly in the beginning. So these guys are kind of like, they're like a superhero team. It's like a Swiss Army knife of all these different personalities and traits and qualities. And I think by doing that, it also collectively feels like it's a shared experience. So they take you through it in a very personal way, which I think makes people connect to this. It's not just lawsuits and facts and figures. You'll notice we don't get into a ton of exposition of like, what is the equal pay and like, how does that relate to the Equal Pay Act in history? We meet these players where they are, how they understand it, which is their own personal experience. And I think that is turned out to be a way that people really respond to films that we've made in the past, when you really put someone on the inside of the experience.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in the picture that that audiences won't expect, right? They won't expect to see this story about the amount of work that goes in, and then I think it's a little bit surprising. One of the emotional reactions I had that you have with the players is this sense of exhaustion, and that word comes out multiple times. So I see you smiling, Becky, so I'm going to ask you about that. Like, what's the toll there, right? Like, doing this work is important. You all say that over and over again in the case, and the fact that you're pressing on sort of makes that point. But there is a sacrifice or something that's being missed and lost here. And if you could speak a little to that, I think it would help sort of fill in that story a little more.
Absolutely. And then I think you have to remember that we are first and foremost soccer players. Like, that is our full-time job. And then you layer onto that a second full-time job, and that's playing for our professional teams. And then you add in another layer of this lawsuit, and none of us are lawyers. None of us have really any sort of legal experience. And so there's just this educational growth where we're just learning about so much, and how the justice system works and how lawsuits work. And that in itself is pretty exhausting, because you're, finding the time to get on these conference calls and, do these emails and all these depositions and prepping for depositions, which is the most frightening thing I've ever gone through. And so there's just all these things that you're not used to, that you're being thrown into with quite a bit of, obvious importance and weight to it. Like, you don't want to mess this up. It's not just our team and our team's value that's on the line. Like, this could set a precedent that could echo throughout so many workplaces. And so there's also the stress of that, and that takes a very emotional and psychological toll as well.
That's helpful to hear about. And Abby, I'm wondering if you might share sort of your perspective on sort of how this process unfolded, right? There's a famous story floating around, and maybe Sean and Andrea can also chime in on this, that basically this added layer of having the film team sort of follow them around required this sort of presentation in the basement of a hotel in which players were a little unsure about what was going to happen here, and you were a little unsure. And Abby, you must have been sweating bullets, because I don't know if you were in the room or not.
Yes.
Can you all sort of talk about, like, what was the deal here that this was going to happen in this way?
Yeah. It's interesting, because I think, like Becky said, making a film like this is such a vulnerable experience. And to make the kind of films that Andrea and Sean do, which is this very personal film, requires a level of closeness, and the subjects have to really be a part. You know, it's not just do an interview and go away. So we did go down to meet with the team, and actually Becky and a couple players beforehand had kind of signed on and were our impresarios. But I will say, as someone, I've been in front of a lot of rooms in my day, but this was a pretty intimidating room because you have, you know, these are badass women's soccer players. They don't suffer fools, and they know what they want. And, you know, I think, Becky, you teed it up to the group that this was an opportunity, but it was for everyone to decide what they wanted to do. And I think that what we did was shared as a team, Sean and Andrea and myself as a producing team, why we felt the story needed to be told, which we very much did, and why we felt this was a unique opportunity. It was sort of a story that if it wasn't told, it would never, we felt, be told this way, because you're either inside of something as it happens like this, or it moves past and it's gone. And you guys at the Smithsonian know this. You either capture history as it happens, and we very much felt, I very much felt with the story from the beginning, this was history in the making. This was a story for the ages, these women who stepped up and did something very brave. So that was our pitch to them, but it was it was a very humbling moment. And I think that we as a team did not take lightly the trust that these players gave us, you know, trusted in us to tell this most precious of things, which was their truth. And when Becky, I think, said to us after watching it that she felt that we honestly captured what it felt like, was like, I think Sean and Andrea and I, because we were in different places and we texted, it was like a poof, you know, first just like a poof, you know, of relief, because as a storyteller and a producer, you want to do right by your subjects. You want to do no harm. And in this case, it was a very tenuous story where a lot was at stake. So we wanted to do no harm, number one, but we also wanted to do right by them. And that was a huge relief to feel that we did that. But yes, it was very intimidating moment.
Becky, can you disclose some of those internal conversations? Was there like, so they make the presentation.
I want to hear this.
Yeah, I don't want to hear it.
Yes.
This is great.
Yeah, I would say that it was a very divided room. And I think, you know, there were people that were really excited to take part and knew that if our story were to be told, this would probably be the best way it could ever be told. And there were others that were just thinking like, this is invasive, it could hurt team chemistry. We don't know these people. Like, what if this is all just like a facade and like they do the film and it's actually a spoof all on us, just insulting us the entire time. Like, up until I saw the screening, I was actually thinking like, what if this is just some sort of like candid camera, gotcha kind of moment. So it was pretty divided. And I think you see the people in the film that really believed that this was the story that needed to be told, and that we gave you our trust and we were willing to do that, even though it scared us. And I would still say that there are people that are probably glad that they didn't take part, because I don't think they were willing to show that vulnerability. And I would also say that some people didn't feel as read into what the lawsuit was about and speaking about it, because that's also something that for me, even I get really nervous about, is speaking on the subject when you really have no experience with it.
And I think like the one thing that we could probably add to this whole thing too is that we went into that meeting too kind of under secrecy a little bit, because we could not let US Soccer know that we were there. And remarkably, they didn't know we were there, and they didn't find out, which I'm just blown away by, because we asked them permission about this film a long time ago when we first started it, way before that meeting. And you know, I think that was something else we were cognizant of, like, will this hurt the team? Will this, like, the team has a lot of power, but I don't know. I mean, it's still, you know, Becky, we had this talk, Andrea and I and Abby, like, it's still your employer. And so, you know, what would this do if they walked in the room and we were there, or they came down the hallway and we were there? And so there was that too, from our standpoint of trying to like do this, but do it in a way that US Soccer didn't know we were there as well, just because we had gotten pretty clear messages from them that, you know, if this film was on equal pay, they would shut it down. And that was from the beginning. And so that was important to us to not kind of, you know, let them know that we were there so that we could still have the access and the honesty from everyone and film the things that we filmed. I think if they would have known we were around maybe more or paid more attention, we might have not been able to capture some of the moments that we were able to capture.
That's fascinating insight. And one of the things that sort of is echoing through this conversation, right? Becky mentioned, I just used the word echoes, but actually Becky had just used that a second ago, talking about the echoes of this case in other areas of labor, of work, and women's work in particular. And then both Abby and Sean just now talking about this, you know, essentially being, you know, to some degree a case for the ages, that there's like a historical importance here. And of course, that's sort of what our museum sort of specializes in. So I'd like to sort of pivot and talk a little bit about these broader scopes and impacts of the case in the film. And I'd like to start by talking about the sort of long history that runs up to this case. The film does a fabulous job of contextualizing this current case and moment with the 90s and the 99ers and the World Cup, which is a story I think, you know, in a group that many people are familiar with. As a historian, you know, you can track this back, of course, to the Equal Pay Act in 1963, but also, of course, to Title IX, which has its 50th anniversary next year. And so, you know, I was wondering, Becky, maybe you first, if you can talk about sort of this longer trajectory. You know, Title IX comes around in 1972. That's an era when many of the players' mothers were in school. So this is, the trajectory of this fight has been long. And so a little perspective in terms of how you as a player see that would be, I think, insightful.
Yeah, I mean, my real start with the idea of women fighting for their value was the 1999 Women's World Cup team. And at that time, I'm 14, and, you know, watching this world event with crowded stadiums, with women that are doing what I want to do, and watching them celebrated and seeing them so empowered, and just knowing that, okay, my life, like, I'm going to dedicate everything to feeling what those women are feeling. And then learning later on that most of them weren't even making a livable wage doing what they're doing. And when they, after the success of 1999, negotiated their first collective bargaining agreement, I mean, that was really just to get paid enough to continue to just focus on soccer. And so for me, every era of the team since that 1999 team has added on and have taken up the fight to fight for our value. And it started very slow with, you know, incremental payments. And it got to the point with our team where we had basically just reached a point where it's like, okay, no, we're going for equal pay. We're going to close this gap that really was never closing. It just happened to get wider and wider the longer and longer that the program was in existence. And so we had just reached a point where we were just fed up, and we were just like, let's go for this.
And Abby, from your perspective in terms of conceptualizing, you know, and sort of trying to make the project happen, was this longer arc in your mind sort of as part of that?
Yeah, well, I think that part of the reason the story resonated with me when I heard the news that the team was suing US Soccer, as someone who's tracked some of the history and whatnot, but who also, like Becky, remembered the 99 team. I knew sort of the history of the team, and I also am I'm a lover of history. This story I felt was a moment, like just reading when they issued that lawsuit on the day that they did. It just felt like a moment in a cultural moment. You know, we're coming off the back of Me Too. Here are these women, they're the best at what they do, unquestionably. I mean, you cannot question because their record speaks for themselves. And the other thing that was so unique about what they did, which I think is so instructive and something I think that we all learn from them, both in this film, but also in how they've played out this as a group, they did it together. They all joined and did this together. And that was something else that was very unique. Like in the past, you have like individual players or individual, but the fact this team said, all together we're doing this, it felt like a departure, and kind of like Becky was saying, it was kind of an all or nothing move. And so it felt like this was a pendulum on which this issue could hinge, and that if we could get inside that to show that history. And I love the sequence that Andrea and Sean built in the movie that tells that arc of history, because it does it in a very beautiful, condensed way. But one of the most powerful moments in the film, I think, is when you see Michelle Akers testifying in front of Congress, and you think to yourself, Groundhog Day, we've been here before, so we can't find ourselves here again. The kind of echoes of history, it takes certain people to break through the echoes and say, no, we're not going to be here again in the next 10 years or 15 years.
I think that's a really powerful point to make, and the notion of unity and togetherness here is important too, because the film touches on, but doesn't necessarily directly engage the Women's Players Association as a sort of union, and so togetherness and unity in the sense of a union is really strong. And I was wondering, in terms of broader echoes and broader impacts, if Andrea and Sean, if you thought, or if Becky, you thought of this case, not just in terms of women's equal pay in all sorts of other fields, which there's that super poignant moment, right, with Sarah Haynes from Good Morning America that was captured, but even in a broader sense, in terms of unionization, which we know over the course of American history has declined, and which our museum has arguably the country's largest collection of labor union materials. So a sense of sort of how unionization and togetherness sort of fit together in this story might be insightful as well. Thank you.
I think from when you look at past ideas of showcasing people trying to come together to change things, that when it comes to sport, that it's usually singular individuals, right? You look at Billie Jean King and see what she does, or you see, but no story has sort of gone into the more current moments and told the perspective from a team. There's almost no films out there about women's teams. It's kind of interesting when you think about it, right? Whether you're talking about documentary, I mean, feature films, anything, right? You could think of a ton of men's, but not for women. And so I think this, in a way, in the way which Becky and her teammates, and because a lot of them are reps on the Players Association, in a way, they are sort of, that aspect is brought into the film by they're the ones doing that. And given leadership roles because of that, I think, in the team, and Becky can speak to that, but it's just this idea that they sort of unionize. You watch them do it. You know, they organize, they create a hierarchy of communication, of dissemination, of making sure they have everyone's buy-in, which is,
even that scene with the signatures, you know, trying to get everybody's signature on that letter rather than just having 4 signatures, or a couple women that represent all of them. It's everybody on that team doing everything possible to get that, is an example, I think, of how important the team is to this team.
And I think that many of the players we interviewed talked to the fact that they said, I would never want to do this alone. The idea that I have a whole team at my back and we step on the field together, we step on and we step into this fight off the field together, it just brings us so much power. And so I think that was a really unique part of how this story kind of fits into a larger picture that I don't think kind of has been told in that way. But, I think how they come together, that's something Becky can talk to so well, because it is amazing about how you guys organize and delegate and, come to consensus despite, there's a lot of personalities on the team. Right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and as someone that's been involved with our Players Association for a bunch of years now, I mean, we've really had to build that up and build an infrastructure and hire an executive director who, to me, is one of the most impressive women I've ever worked with, soccer or otherwise. And a lot of that is trust. And we get appointed as player representatives. And some players have the energy for more engagement, some want a little bit less engagement, some just want to focus on soccer. And so it's the trust that the people that are put in those player rep positions, or the legal committee, we have a bunch of little committees, that the people that are put in those positions have the trust of all the membership. And I'll just say that our union, the way that we've grown as far as communication, disseminating information, gaining consensus. Like that's definitely been an evolution that trial and error, we're getting better and better, but it's still a work in progress. And unions, just from talking with, the WNBA and with USA Hockey, the unions have done so much for the advancements of women's rights in the workplace. I mean, I have been so impressed by like the USA Hockeys and the WNBA and what they've been able to do as a collective, and the strength they have as a collective when they're negotiating with their employer. And so I'm just really proud. I know that our union speaks actually with other players unions within international women's soccer. And so I've got a Canadian on my professional team, and we just go back and forth and we talk about certain things relating to our CBAs, and we gather ideas from one another and we share, because we all just want to keep empowering each other and just keep, heightening the ceiling.
That networking is so important to highlight, and the film does it, with a couple of clips of sort of ripped headlines, right, Andrea and Sean, that sort of show this resonating, mostly in other soccer circumstances. Are you all? This is just a totally open question, but are you all, Becky, are you all also in communication with like the WTA association? Because they're ones who have come really close. It's not statistically equal yet, but they've come really close.
I personally have never spoken with anyone from the WTA, but I know that I have taken a lot of inspiration and motivation from Venus Williams and her fight for equal prize money in tournaments. And just, I think there's a wonderful documentary out there about that. And then you have Billie Jean King with the Battle of the Sexes. And so, I mean, I just think women's tennis in general has been kind of a beacon and a trailblazer in the fight for equal pay.
Yeah, thanks for that that connection. And then I thought there was also one other moment. There's a moment when your lawyer is giving an interview and he's wearing an NFLPA polo shirt. Is there a connection there?
Yes, there is a connection. Obviously, the NFLPA, super built out, very successful, has done great things for all the players within football. And we've been really fortunate that they've wanted to help us and kind of like guide us in certain things that we've never really thought of. And one of those things is commercial licensing, and how can we kind of test our market value? And that's something that they've really helped. They actually have created agencies and taken on our union to help us and to give us that infrastructure that we can kind of test that marketplace and see if we can bring in different revenues, different ways of bringing in revenue.
Like I remember after the World Cup, a lot of the jerseys sold out, but the PA, through some creative licensing deals, was able to create their own product. And that was like talking to Becca Rue, who runs the Players Association, that was a real source of revenue. So it's like very innovative, which really is another thing we don't get into so much in the film, but that is not something that anybody else imposed on the team. The women built this from the ground up. And Becky knows this history because she's kind of been involved at every place, but they hired someone to run the union, and they set up the structure. And this is all within the last, Becky, how many years?
I would say 6 years maybe.
Yeah. So this is pretty recent. And when you think of all that they've done in that time, there's building this union infrastructure and then taking on this lawsuit is pretty extraordinary.
And then the breadth even further, right? Talking about specifically on issues of women's equal pay, but in non-entertainment or non-athletic fields necessarily, maybe still technically within entertainment. We mentioned the Sarah Haynes comment earlier. Have Becky, Andrea, or Sean, have you heard from women? Has there been feedback from women in other sectors about how this film can be used in similar kinds of cases, or to mobilize women in other fields?
I mean, we've heard from numerous women how it's been inspiring. We've heard from, personal women that have gone in and decided to ask for equal pay after seeing the film on a personal level and try to figure out how to make that happen. We've had employers contact us and actually literally look at their books after they saw the film and say, wow, oh my gosh, I'm not paying people equal, and change that, and and, you know, medium scale to large scale companies. And so it has had a ripple effect. You know, I know also that the CEO of Title IX, the company, you know, gave $1 million to the Players Association after she saw the film. So, you know, the film has done a lot already in that, and I think it will continue to do that. I think that's our hope, at least all of us, that it's not just a one and done, that it can keep doing that and keep evolving and keep being used as a tool.
Mm-hmm. And you know, the idea that being valued and valuing the people in a workplace is a basic fundamental. And so if we do our jobs right with this film, that people can walk away asking different questions. If you're an employee, if you're an employer, and you know, this is the time, I think, you know, Abby speaks about like kind of this is the moment. I think we're all living through a colossal moment, you know, as things are being redefined about equality in general, you know, and I think that this film fits in that way of showcasing, like, if people look back at this, you know, in the future, and they come back and say, well, what does this film mean? What did it, you know, it gives you an insight into what it felt like to go through it at that time. And in that way, it's kind of evergreen. And it's evergreen, and it's non kind of denominational to sport or just to law. It's just that essence of saying, and it's also something that connects to a question that's been asked for a really long time by women, you know, in this country, especially, or even globally, that like it's kind of I always feel like sexism in some ways is like the last ism that people feel kind of comfortable still carrying off anymore. And I think I watch that when you hear just ignorant stuff being said about, you know, the women's team or the lawsuit or whichever, even while we're making it and people talk to us, there's so much misunderstanding and misperception about this. So you know, our hope is that this kind of sheds a light in a lot of different directions. It's sort of buckshot on equality overall, but it's also very specifically kind of hoping to dissolve some misunderstandings about this fight, this lawsuit, this team, and what they deserve.
Yeah, that's another example of how it sort of moves in multiple tracks at the same time, this picture, which I think is really powerful and important. Abby, can you talk a little bit about, and Andrea and Sean also, and then I'll come back to Becky about this, the choice of where to end the piece. Was it always going to be when the decision sort of came down, or was there flexibility on that back end? How did that sort of shake out from, I guess, all four of your perspectives?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Andrea and Sean can chime in too, because really, you know, with the doc and this story in particular, we did not know, of course, where the story would end. And there were moments, because as you saw in the film, for those that have seen it, the women go and mediate after the World Cup. So there was a moment where as a team, we thought, well, maybe this movie is going to end before it even started, right? We kept thinking it's going to resolve itself, and actually it never quite did. And I think the thing that was powerful about that moment as sort of the ending of the movie, it was this real emotional arc. I think as a viewer, you go on an emotional arc, and Sean and Andrea did an amazing job of setting that up. I think it's the emotional arc, and I'm interested what Becky, if you would feel this, that was a kind of moment in this journey. It was a bit of a gut punch. It came as a surprise, but it also was this reaffirmation, a moment of recommitment. And it also is probably, if you talk to people, and I have, and I know Sean and Andrea have, talked to people that have been through fighting for something for a long time that they care a lot about, a lot of them talk about a similar kind of moment where you get the gut punch and you simultaneously recommit. And it felt like it's not the end of the story, but it's the end of this movie. And I also love how Sean and Andrea, at the end, there's sort of this coda, which is, you know, in this time, you know, you have Meghan going to the White House, you have the soccer team that brings on their appeals team. So you really have the sense the fight goes on. And we still don't know where the story will end. Right, Becky?
Exactly. Still fighting.
Right?
The story
They're
goes on.
still fighting, you know? So I think in some ways that the ending had to be a non-ending, but it felt like a real meaningful emotional arc. And that felt satisfying. And I think we talked about as a team, every time we watched it, we all teared up. like every time, because it was such a raw moment. And when we talk about being vulnerable and giving trust, I think that was probably one of the hardest moments. But I think it's probably the most powerful moment too, because as a viewer, you feel what it's like, and it hurts and it's painful because you don't understand it. And Becky, when you were talking about you were 14 when you watched the 99ers, I thought I have a 14-year-old and she watched you guys play. And that moment of the film, the first time I screened it and watched it with her, I looked over and she just had tears rolling down her face. And I thought, and she kind of wiped them off. And then at the end, she just said, we got to do this. They're going to do this. And that's what I loved about the end, because it was fire me up.
So that's a great segue, if we can, Becky. Obviously, the film ends with the decision to appeal, and that was sort of summer of 2020. For our viewers who maybe haven't been following so closely, can you sort of fill us in on what's transpired over the last year or so?
Yeah,
in a sort of
I can condense this very easily. We're still in the appeals process. We filed some amicus briefs and we had some amazing support for people that really believed in our fight. And US Soccer actually just recently filed their response brief. And so now the ball's back in our court. We file a response to their response. I'm learning all about the appeals process, but it's just ongoing. And we know that we're optimistic that the appeals process will overturn the judge's original decision, and that we'll get to litigate. And we would love to bring this in front of a jury. I think our lawyers are great. I think obviously our players are wonderful, and so I think we have a real great shot. And who knows if we're going to settle this from here to there. That's always a possibility. We're also currently negotiating our CBA, so if we can achieve equal pay through that, that's excellent. So we still have these avenues open to us. And yeah, the appeals process, it's a long process, definitely.
And so I just want to sort of reference per our conversation about unions, right? The AFL-CIO, the leading union organization in the country, in fact, filed an amicus brief, a friend of court on your behalf. In that brief, they do sort of reference some things that relate to the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement that you just referenced. And I would not be doing my job if I didn't ask sort of what your thought was on US Soccer's presentation of terms about the CBA regarding some version of equal pay, mostly predicated on sort of equally dividing up World Cup prize money.
So, okay, sorry. So were you asking exactly about the future of dividing up the World Cup prize money, or how we solve
I'm asking, I'm asking for sort of your thoughts on sort of US Soccer's statement about that element of a CBA moving forward.
Yeah, they kind of punted that to the PAs to kind of solve on our own. And so we are now going to have to be in constant communication with the men's national team PA and try to get really creative. I think the men who also filed an amicus brief on our behalf, I think they're willing, and I know we're certainly willing to meet together to solve this. And it's a significant amount of money. And so both sides feel that we can be creative, think outside of the box, and really come up with a solution to equalize that World Cup prize money, because it's a decent chunk of change.
It is interesting, historically speaking, athletes unions are a little bit different than in other sectors, economic sectors, where women have made great gains by having unions that cross gender lines. Is that something in the conversation moving forward, or is that something where these two players associations are going to continue to try to collaborate, but they're going to be separate?
I think there's always the potential for us to fall under one players association. I also think that under the US Soccer umbrella, there are youth national teams, there are extended national teams, there's Paralympic national teams. And so who knows in the future, maybe all the members of US Soccer fall under one players association. At the time, that's not happening, but I would never say no, that's not going to happen. And I just think this could be that first step in seeing if we could fall under under one umbrella with the men's national team PA and ourselves. And so we'll see how these communications go in the next few weeks.
And so I would have to conclude then by asking Andrea and Sean if they're on board or considering the sequel.
It depends if
It depends.
Becky and everyone let us film
I
them
know,
again.
they might be done with cameras. for a
Might
long
be done with
time.
it. No, I mean, we never say no. You know, obviously it's an amazing story, and it's a story that keeps unfolding, that we keep watching. So we'll never say no, but I think I'm sure everybody wants a break from the camera for a little bit.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening for this conversation and for your insight. We encourage folks to watch the film, get a better sense of what we've been talking about here, and hope that this conversation has been useful and enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
We
you
really
very much.
appreciate it. Thanks.
Appreciate it.